Hello, this is Callum Murray with a podcast interview on the subject of the Athlete Biological Passport, or ABP, on behalf of the Biathlon Integrity Unit. My guest is Lasse Bækken of the Norwegian Doping Control Laboratory, who's been working with the Athlete Biological Passport in anti-doping since 2015. He's also involved in the analysis of whole blood samples and EPO, and his work on the ABP has been published in several scientific publications. So he's the perfect guide to the ABP for athletes and support staff. I began by asking him to explain the idea or principle of the ABP and why we need it.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for the possibility to participate in this podcast. Thank you a lot. Yeah, so I can start by saying that in traditional anti-doping testing, the aim is to prove doping by directly identifying a prohibited substance or a prohibited method in a urine or a blood sample, while in the Athlete Biological Passport, the aim is to indirectly reveal doping by looking for the physiological effects of these prohibited substances or methods. This is done by measuring some selected variables of doping, the so-called biomarkers of doping. So this is very helpful as the effect of some substances on the biomarkers may persist longer than the substance itself can be found in the body. And of course, the ABP, or the Athlete Biological Passport, is also very important in identifying athletes that should be tested more, and can also be used as a helpful tool in investigations.
So, yes, and in reply to the second part of the question, why do we need it? I think you probably answered that by saying that, as you say, the markers persist much longer than the doping substance would show up on a test.
Yeah, correctly. So in some instances, the substance can be excreted quite quickly, but the effects of this will be visible for a longer time. Yeah, correct.
And historically, I thought it was introduced, I don't know, about 10 years ago, was it, the ABP, something like that? And was it in cycling that it was first introduced?
No, yeah. So the official implementation of the ABP and the hematological module, so the blood passport module, was in 2009,
right,
2010. But of course, many federations started to collect some blood samples prior to this to look at the biomarkers of doping. But the official implementation was in 2009, and from that point, it has been possible to sanction an athlete based on the passport alone without having a positive test. And yeah.
So it's regarded as a big success in the fight against doping.
Yes, absolutely. It can be used in many different ways. Initially, it was mainly used to target test athletes, so you could test the correct athlete more often, and you can also do additional analysis to have more, so to say, positive tests, so traditional direct detection. And then over the years, it has been, as I said, possible to sanction based on the passport alone, and it's possible to also use it as an investigative tool.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, without getting too technical, how does the ABP work?
Yes, so I already said that we have a hematological module of the ABP. We also have some others, but let's focus on the blood passport for now. This is to detect blood doping. And blood doping is the practice of misusing some techniques or substances to increase the number of red blood cells that contain this protein, hemoglobin, that transports oxygen to your muscles to increase your endurance. So in this blood passport, a blood sample, of course, is collected from an athlete, this sample is placed in a secure container, is then shipped to a World Anti-Doping Agency accredited laboratory for analysis. And once this sample has been analyzed, the results of this blood sample are uploaded to the WADA's ADAMS database. I'm sure that many athletes, they are familiar with ADAMS, where they put their whereabouts. So this is also where we find the results of the blood results. So once these results are in ADAMS, they are matched to the athlete that got tested. So each sample is compared to previous samples from this athlete. So each athlete kind of acts like their own reference or own control, so that we longitudinally can look at the blood markers to look for suspicious patterns and to look for blood doping. And these results, they are reviewed by something called the Athlete Passport Management Unit, abbreviated APMUs. And these APMUs, they are mainly located in laboratories around the world, and they are approved by WADA. And I work in such an APMU, and we review the blood samples and results as they get into ADAMS. And based on these, we can identify suspicious patterns, samples, and guide testing. And then it's also possible to send these blood passports to independent experts who are affiliated with the APMUs. So they are trained in ADAMS, they are trained in blood doping, in confounding factors like altitude and medical conditions. And if three independent experts thinks that the most likely reason for this variation in the blood passport is due to doping, then it's possible to sanction an athlete based on the blood passport alone.
It's interesting you mentioned altitude, as we're dealing with biathlon, which is obviously a sport that happens often at some altitude. So altitude can affect the results.
Yeah. So it has been long known that altitude affects the hematological system. So it increases your production of red blood cells, and it also affects the plasma volume, so the amount of water in your blood. And this is seen in a blood passport. So there are many studies looking into the effects of training or staying at altitude on the hematological passport or the blood passport. And we who work in these APMUs and in the laboratories, we are well known with this effect, and so are the experts who evaluate the passports. So this is noted both in the whereabouts, if an athlete is submitting whereabouts, but also in the doping control form during a test. The athlete declares if he or she has been to altitude for the last 2 weeks, and it's important that the athletes, they inform correctly about this altitude travels, so that it may be taken into account when looking at the passports.
Okay, that's interesting, and obviously something that biathletes should bear in mind. Could the ABP ever replace traditional anti-doping testing?
Well, the short answer is no. And that's because they are complementary. So you need both. In fact, as I said earlier, the blood passport or the ABP can be used to direct traditional direct testing. So based on blood value, you can do an additional analysis and thereby having a positive or a direct positive test, the traditional anti-doping test. And in fact, since the implementation of the ABP, there has been a large increase in the number of positive EPO tests. So it could be found in a urine or blood sample that an athlete has administered EPO, this hormone that increases the red blood cell production, based on abnormal values in the blood sample. So it cannot replace, they are complementary, and they go very good hand in hand. And it's also very important to mention that many substances that are not detected by the blood passport, they can be found in a urine or a blood sample by direct traditional anti-doping testing.
So I know some athletes are concerned that the volume of blood collected for testing might affect their performance. Can you reassure them that that's not the case?
Yeah, I can. That's not the case. The amount that is collected during a doping control is very low. So in an average person, there is about 5 liters of blood. This, of course, depends on the sex, the size, their weight, their training status, and so on. And during a doping control, where a blood passport sample is collected, it's only collected around 3 milliliters of blood. And that's about 0.0006% of your total blood volume. That's a very, very small amount and will not affect your performance. There may be collected some more blood samples during a control, but still the blood volume is very low compared to your blood volume. So it will not impact your performance. And there is a continuous natural production of red blood cells in your body to ensure that the body stays in balance. So the short answer is no.
Okay, so that should reassure athletes, I hope. Last question. Are athlete biological passports mandatory for biathletes, and who needs to have one?
Yeah, so according to World Anti-Doping Agency requirements, the implementation of blood passport is mandatory in biathlon. And it concerns those biathletes that are part of an anti-doping organization's test distribution plan and also part of their registered testing pool. So an anti-doping organization like IBU needs to plan blood passport tests for athletes that are in this pool. So it's up to the IBU to plan and to conduct these tests,
Okay.
or a national anti-doping or agency.
Okay, and if a biathlete is or should have an ABP, they are contacted by one of those organizations to tell them that?
Well, so the international federation, so the IBU or the National Anti-Doping Organization where the athlete is from, they select based on their own risk assessment and anti-doping test distribution plan who they are going to test. So then they plan such tests for those athletes they include in their pool.
Excellent. Lasse, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast interview on behalf of the Biathlon Integrity Unit. Really interesting, and I hope that athletes listening to this interview will take a lot from it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being able to participate. Thank you.